them not only that we cared, but we all wanted to disseminate our knowledge in a very proactive way. We wanted to make sure that they received the information that they found critically important, so we decided to launch a new website called B-Span, which was a webcasting station. Webcasting is the showing of audio and video files over the internet. And we had two basic principles. The first was we would be completely transparent, absolutely no editing or censoring of our broadcasts, which were internal policy dialogues of the World Bank. That would provide us authenticity with our external audiences. The second principle was we would permanently archive, so we would become a library of development dialogues. And this B-Span vehicle of broadcasting internal policy dialogues in a completely transparent and uncensored format was embraced by thousands of people, tens of thousands outside the World Bank, hundreds inside the World Bank. But as one might suspect, it would create a bit of a cultural clash with an institution that had, for decades, the cultural norm of hoarding information and releasing only perfect information. So the book, The World Bank Unveiled, is really, it's two stories. It's one, the personal experience of how B-Span evolved and the impact it had of the two cultures, and also how that's relevant to the World Bank's role, larger question of whether it's effective in poverty reduction.
Well, it sounds like a lot of the information was through the internet. Why did you decide to write a book?
Well, I wrote the book because I think there's a startling difference between the rhetoric that the World Bank uses and the reality of how it acts. And I think the gap between this rhetoric and reality is significant enough to mitigate the good intentions of many people inside the World Bank. And as a result, the World Bank is not as effective as it could be or should be. And ultimately, the biggest losers are the bank's constituents, the people who live in poverty. So I think that by writing the book, I'm talking about difficult things, but I try to do it in an open and honest way. And my hope is that the impact of that is that it reduces this gap, improves the bank's accountability, and restores a measure of faith for the bank between its stakeholders and shareholders.
Now, David, you know, there have been other books written about the World Bank and the IMF and everything else. What makes your book, World Bank Unveiled, different from other books written about the bank?
Well, frankly, I think the book is unique because almost all the other books that have been written about the bank, not completely, but almost all of them have been from external observers, academics, economists who are looking at the bank's policymaking, lending activities, and making assessments of whether they've been effective on the global stage of the world's economy and development issues. Mine, however, is a very different perspective. It's an internal perspective from somebody who actually worked inside the institution and saw how people acted and behaved on a daily basis, who assessed the bureaucracy and the culture and the incentive systems that made people act and do things the way they did. So mine is very much an inside-out perspective, while almost all other perspectives are outside-in.
Well, does the book talk a little bit about what prevents the bank from being transparent, if you address that?
Yeah, I think there's, well, I would say this. I think, to be fair, the World Bank has made some progress on this issue of transparency and accountability. And to digress just momentarily, I believe transparency is not just about opening up and increasing access to information. It is that, but it also is about greater accountability for the decision-making that happens inside the institution. It's also about more participation and inclusivity to allow all stakeholders to have a say in some of the lending activities of the bank. Having said that, I think the World Bank has made progress over the last 2 decades. And perhaps it's fair to say that it's made more progress than its counterpart, international financial institutions. But having said that, over the last 2 decades, the steps that the World Bank has taken has been because of external observers' pressure from external forces. So the bank has been very reactive in the steps that it's taken, and it hasn't been proactive, which suggests that perhaps the internal culture doesn't embrace transparency fully. It's just reacting to external pressure, and I think there's some reasons behind that. I talked a little bit about the history of the institution and how information the culture of the institution is to hoard information and to release perfect information. That goes to the historical antecedents of the institution. The bank, when it was created at the end of World War II, had to accrue the favor of financial markets, including Wall Street, and so confidentiality was a key aspect of the bank's work. So it would collect information, but it would be very careful about how it disseminated information. And so this is ingrained in the DNA of the institution's culture, and over 6 decades, that's hardened to a significant degree. So again, it's about hoarding information and releasing perfect information to targeted audiences. Obviously, I was in the work of releasing imperfect information to anybody who needed or wanted access, a very different aspect of it. The second key factor on what inhibits the bank from becoming more transparent is that what I consider probably the most important structural inefficiency of the institution, where there's basically 2 decision-making strata within the institution. There is senior level and mid-management level. And senior level management is reacting to important pressures from shareholders such as donor countries and the borrower countries. It's reacting to pressure from financial markets, from the prevailing business trends of the day, from the media, from civil society actors, NGOs and whatnot. And so they're constantly shifting their strategy, constantly doing reorganizations of the institution. That's been continual over the last quarter century. So while the upper level management is sort of tacking with the wind, feeling the pressures from a variety of sources, it is relying on mid-level managers who to implement the strategic decisions or organizational reforms. But to accrue power inside the bank means that mid-level managers who are really fiefdom owners have to adhere to the status quo, which means play conservative, don't go too far, don't be too far out in front, don't be too far behind. And so there's a definite conflict in the motivations of these 2 stratas within the bank. And I think part of that is the information hoarding doesn't make mid-level managers embrace the concept of transparency and accountability, because ultimately they're the ones who are going to have to be the most transparent and the most accountable.
Yeah. David, you mentioned certainly the structure with the upper management reacting to the various external things, and the middle management trying to keep things going, keep the general business of the bank going. Do you have some suggestions or thoughts on the types of reforms that you think would make the bank more effective?
Yes, and I talk a lot about that in the book, in the last section of the book. I think there's a number of reforms. Let me back off by saying that I think there's a number of reforms that are being discussed in public today by development think tanks and development NGOs with the World Bank, and as well as shareholders, the country members of the bank. And these include focusing on making the selection process of the next World Bank president transparent and merit-based, not necessarily an American, increasing the voice and voting power of developing countries on the bank's operating boards, and increasing developing countries' membership on the board of directors. I think these are positive reforms, but these types of reforms address the top-tier structure of the institution and its relationship with shareholders and stakeholders. The types of reforms that I think would be most important are from an internal perspective. How do you change the bureaucracy? How do you change the cultural norms of the institution? And for that, I think one of the most important things you should do is remove the accountability mechanisms that are inside the bank. There's a number of accountability mechanisms that have been established over the last 2 decades inside the World Bank, but they either have to answer to the board of directors or the bank's senior management. And sometimes their recommendations aren't implemented, so they don't have the mandate to change things. They can only offer suggestions. So I think it's critical that these accountability mechanisms need to be removed from the institution and given to independent arbitrators. A second reform that I think is important is to change the managerial selection process. The bank really favors hiring academics with significant excellence and technocrats also with significant excellence, but it's not in the habit of hiring managers or promoting from within people who have good leadership skills, who are innovators and entrepreneurs. And I think the bank needs a much more holistic outlook on how it promotes its managerial core. A third reform that I think would be very positive would be to put a civil society representative on the board of directors. It would increase the participation and inclusivity of civil society's concerns in the bank's decision making. It would also make civil society accountable for the decisions that the bank makes. So I think it works on in a lot of respects. Although the political fallout from this may be significant, I think it's an interesting idea that should be explored. A couple of other reforms that I think, the two last reforms that I think that would be important is the World Bank Institute, which is the pedagogical arm of the institution, has what we call a library storehouse model where it dispenses knowledge nuggets to its clients. I think it should be an open library, open storehouse model where clients can come to the bank and find out the history of things that are happening and decide for themselves what they need. And the last reform I would suggest is to reestablish a B-SPAN type of mechanism to communicate to the outside world.
Yeah. David, thank you very much. I mean, lots of wonderful information, both the background on why you wrote the book and a lot of things that are in the book. Thanks again for being on our program and sharing with us and sharing with our viewers all this wonderful information about the World Bank.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
For the Rotary Times, I'm Rotarian Michael McCormack, your host, with the Rotary Club of Falls Church, Virginia, along with Rotarian Su Young Min with the Rotary Club of Bailey's Crossroads, Virginia. You're welcome to join us at one of our weekly meetings any Thursday evening at 6:30 p.m. at the Harvest Moon Restaurant on Arlington Boulevard in Falls Church, Virginia. Remember, our time is your time, and it's time well spent. Please join us for our next Rotary Times program as we continue to celebrate Rotary's 100 years of service above self.